Hello and welcome everyone. I'm Tigray and today I'm joined by Yacob Mulugetta. Yacob is a professor at the University College of London. His focus is on energy and development. We're going to talk about that later. And he's someone who has made some commentaries regarding Ethiopia and Tigray as well. So we're going to have a conversation about Tigray. And we're going to talk more generally about his journey from Ethiopia to where he is now. I hope he has a lot to offer, to educate us in terms of his journey, and you're going to find it fascinating. And thank you very much for taking the time to join me, Yacob.
Thank you, Tigray. Pleasure to be with you. Absolutely. Thank you for the invitation.
It's my pleasure. So maybe we could start with you telling us a little bit about what it is that you are doing now in terms of the research, Yacob.
Well, as you highlighted, Tigray, I'm based at University College London. I work from the Department of Science, Technology, Engineering and Public Policy, which is located within the Engineering and Sciences faculty. And of course, like every academic, I do my teaching. So I teach in areas of clean energy and development, as well as innovation and development. So in many ways, the way I look at energy is through the lens of development and well-being, and as much as possible to locate energy into the kind of people-centered lens. Sometimes energy is seen from a technology side, others look at it from finance. I try to stay as close as possible to try and address people and well-being as being the drivers of energy development. I am involved in a variety of research areas over the past few years. There was a project that I led on agro-industries and energy in Africa, which also involved a number of countries: Uganda, Kenya, Ethiopia, and Tanzania, I believe, yeah. And part of that was really to try and understand energy access from the perspective of, well, often when we talk about energy, there is one of the challenges is, do you have the technical capability for, let's say, rural communities? Do they have that in store in order to be able to build but also maintain their energy systems? And we thought that agro-industries, whether they're sugar or tea industries, they have their base in rural areas, but they also are producers and consumers of energy for themselves. So our question really was, these, call them anchor industries, serve as sites for expanding access beyond their boundaries to try and serve communities at large. So that went on for 5 or so years. And then, more recently, I was involved in community-based energy systems, which again involved 3-4 countries, which included Ethiopia. But in this case, we also had partnership from Mekelle University through some colleagues there. And of course, that to some extent, that project was interrupted by the war, the conflict. And more recently, I'm part of a fairly large consortium known as Climate Compatible Growth Program, which is supported by the UK government, and the purpose across 6 to 8 countries, 3 to 4 in Africa and another 3 to 4 in Asia. The purpose of it really is to look at the way in which countries need to situate themselves when they are expanding into the low carbon energy territory, and what sort of policies, what sort of planning systems they need to put in place, and how do they access finance. So these are complex sort of issues that we're dealing with. Membership, the partnership is some of the main universities in the UK, which involves UCL, my institution, Imperial College, Oxford, Cambridge, and Loughborough University. So these are, in the broader sense, the things that I'm involved in. Also, we can talk in more detail about specific ideas and projects as we move into the conversation.
Well, interesting is a lot of things that you are trying to do within the realm of energy, I suppose. And some of the terms that you used are terms that are sort of in the modern zeitgeist when people talk about climate change, about renewable energy, and about climate denialism and a lot of other things. So maybe, again, we're going to assume that our listeners are intelligent and all that, including me, so we can understand but we don't have any expertise in these areas. So you're going to sort of zoom out of the details and tell us what exactly this whole domain of clean energy is. So what do people mean when they say clean energy? Maybe we could start with that.
Yeah, well, I mean, clean energy has a wide range of definitions, and in many ways it depends who you're talking to. So if you're talking to people who are very much, sort of invested in fossil fuel technologies, and this is really coal, oil and gas, they would be in a position to frame their understanding of energy or clean energy in the context of, well, some of the argument, for instance, is that, well, there are some technologies that are clean coal. That use certain components of technologies that give the sense that at least, if you're able to use the most modern coal power plants, let's say, then the emissions or greenhouse gas emissions, but also local emissions would be somewhat reduced. So you have coal is perhaps, at the top end of it. And then, as you come down into the other fossil fuels, then, you have oil, which has a lower amount of carbon within each unit of oil. Similar things happen. And then, you have gas. Gas is clearly significantly lower than these two, but still has quite a lot of greenhouse gas emissions. So then you have a whole host of other technologies that are, let's say, greenhouse gas free or relatively free. And here you can come up with, for instance, nuclear. Many energy analysts argue that nuclear is perhaps the best way to try and think about clean energy. And then, of course, you have the renewables, which are such as solar, wind, hydro, and geothermal, that are, at least at the point of use, that they are carbon neutral. So in many ways, it depends who you're talking to and how they frame their energy agenda and how they frame that within the context of climate change. By and large, I would say that the majority, let's say, who work on clean energy would have a position that fossil fuel technologies, in the general sense, should stay underground. They should not be taken out, because the moment you start taking them out, you start using them, in which case then, you're going to your greenhouse gas emissions. And so the best way or the safest way is to keep them underground and concentrate on the type of technologies that do not have those offending gases such as CO2 and methane as much as possible. So I think it's a very murky kind of terrain, and in many ways it depends, who you're talking to. Of course, if you're talking about climate as being the main entry point, as we are approaching, we're approaching a point where, let's say, the 1.5 degrees centigrade is in danger of being breached. If you look at the data, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change work, it tells us that we have something like 6-7 years before we exceed and move into the beyond, the 1.5, global temperature. What that means, of course, is that it has major ramifications for different regions, and therefore the task is to try and keep to under the 1.5 degrees as much as possible. And so the argument that many present is that if you continue to use coal, oil, and gas, there is no way that you can keep yourself within the 1.5 degrees or even the 2 degrees centigrade, which is the kind of the marker that some climate specialists use. So and then of course, each technology also has local consequences, local environmental consequences. If you take China, for instance, one of the drivers of the Chinese energy system is local pollution, air pollution. If you've been to Beijing, you would quickly recognize that there is some, problem with the local air. And so the Chinese are a lot more sensitive about air pollution. And therefore, they are beginning to sort of transition their energy systems, although it's not very easy. The Chinese, for instance, are the biggest investors in renewable energy technologies, and this is, wind and solar. And many people think, well, this is to do with commercial gain that they will get out of it, which probably has some truth in it. But the other aspect of it is also they want to transition into a different type of an energy system, a cleaner energy system, so that they avoid their local pollutions, which is having major consequences, health consequences in their cities.
You mentioned the IPCC report. Were you not a member of the team that authored? Am I? Yeah, you were a member of the team of experts.
Yeah. So the IPCC has it has gone through 6 cycles already since the early 90s. So the way it works is that, well, do you want me to just...
I think we'll come back to that, to the detail. You mentioned the 1.5 and the target and whether or not we're likely to breach it and all that. We'll come to that a bit later. But maybe more broadly now, you said that if we were to agree on the definition of clean energy, my understanding is that the grand objective is to move away from fossil fuel based energy to renewable based energy, right? That's roughly speaking, that's what's happening here.
Yeah.
So is one of the reasons for sort of objection to the whole climate change momentum that countries that have economies based on fossil fuel would be disproportionately damaged by that shift? Like, for instance, Saudi Arabia would naturally be less keen on that. Is that fair to say?
Oh yeah, I mean, totally. If you were a Saudi policymaker, you would be worried about it because your economy is very much based on exporting oil and gas, oil mainly. So yeah, and not only that, but also their own energy system is built around fossil fuels. But it's not only Saudi Arabia, of course. Many people tend to sort of point a finger at Saudi Arabia, and of course it has a role to play. Of course, there's also the UAE and Qatar and some of the other countries around the area. You also have the United States. The United States is the biggest producer of fossil fuels, and even under President Biden and Obama, this has continued. And the framing for the United States is we don't want, energy independence is very much the kind of mantra they use as much as possible, not, trying to limit their dependency on foreign oil. So yeah, I think, you have a real lock-in for those countries such as Saudi Arabia that are, fossil fuel producers. You also have major fossil fuel users, and this includes, of course, China, the US, without a doubt, but also India is becoming quite a big consumer in this. And not only that, but what you also have is that they are using more and more coal. So even though a lot of investment in renewables is taking place in China and India, they're also building more and more coal power plants. So in some ways, they are locking deeper and deeper. So that, for example, if you look at coal power plants around the world, and you look at those in, let's say, in Europe and North America, they tend to be older. Many of them, the majority of them, have been there for 30, 40 years. And therefore, for Europe to be talking about transitioning out of coal is a much easier conversation to have, because the coal plants only have very limited time left in them. Therefore, they can actually get out of it in a kind of organic way. If you look at China, India, Indonesia, and various countries, or South Africa, although South Africa is also similar to the Europeans in the sense of the age of their power stations. But take China and India, they have continued to build over the past 10, 15, and today as well. In fact, I was looking at some data not long ago that China is building more coal power plants than it had in the past 2-3 years, let's say, or at least it's commissioning them. What that means is that what you have then is a kind of a lock-in or a sunk cost in this infrastructure, and they're not going to phase that out in the next 5 to 10 years. So these have to, to run for a period of time because investment has gone into them. So you've got the producers such as Saudi Arabia that depend heavily on it. Their economy is very much centralized on that. So the aim for those countries is to begin to diversify their economies. And you see them, sort of maneuvering around, to try and build industries of various kinds. then you have the Nigerias and the Angolas, which are like almost exclusively dependent on this. For them, the transition out of fossil fuel becomes even more difficult, largely because they haven't been able to invest in other activities and other industries. So they are very much, locked in. Then, of course, you have the Chinas and the Indias that are industrializing in a big way. And their energy use is very much of a mixed type, but still quite significant. Now, and then you can compare, for instance, you take Germany. Germany is talking about pulling out of coal, I believe, sometime in 2030 something. And if you look at the impact on Germany's economy or on Germany's jobs, is something around 15,000 or so. If you're talking about India and China, you're talking about 2, 3, 4 million people. So the scale of it and the difficulty of it and the challenge of it is very much dependent on specific countries. So it's a tough sort of territory there to look at. I mean, the interesting one could be, and so we often talk about, well, how can countries diversify their fossil fuel producers, diversify their economies? The interesting one could be Dubai. UAE has about, 7 kingdoms, and one of them is Dubai, and something like 10, 15, and they all had oil and gas, including Dubai, Abu Dhabi being the biggest one. That's the main producer one. They have much bigger reserves. And the Dubai leadership realized, well, we're running out of this thing. And so they began to kind of move early. That's why you see Dubai becoming a hub for transport, for logistics and tourism and so forth. So it's an interesting example there where diversification actually happened because they were forced to do that.
Well, so this might be a draft question, but
right.
Never mind. Yeah, bear with me. So take a country like Ethiopia, for instance, right, where large parts of the country is not electrified.
Yeah.
Would it be right or would Ethiopian politicians be justified if they went up to the Westerners and told them, you industrialized, you didn't have any qualms about using fossil fuels in doing so, and now it's not fair for you to turn to us and to tell us that we should focus on renewables only, which would make the whole electrification process more expensive and more lengthy? Would that be a justifiable position? And indeed, is it something that African countries or less developed countries generally say, or am I inventing something that's stupid?
No. This is an ongoing debate. Absolutely. In my view, it's not unjustified for Ethiopia to say that. First of all, let's take Ethiopia as an example. Ethiopia's carbon footprint is just insignificant. It makes no difference. Even if Ethiopia's economy grew by tenfold, it wouldn't make a difference at all on global greenhouse and decarbonization process. And because, that's the kind of stuff that colleagues maybe we can take an even more concrete example of Senegal and Mozambique. These are two countries that have recently discovered quite significant amount of gas. And of course they're happy to some extent, but they're also a bit stumped in terms of raising the finance to be able to build the kind of infrastructure that would allow them to be able to at least take out the gas and convert it to LPG and into liquid gas and be able to export it. So, what they have is two options. Let's take Mozambique. It has two options. One is to be able to use for its own industrialization purposes. The other one is just to sell it, to extract it and sell it. The same with Senegal. The interesting thing is that until about 3-4 years ago, these countries were denied, particularly by Europeans, to raise the kind of finance that would allow them to do that. And part of it is that arguing, we are reaching the end of fossil fuel, therefore you guys, should start thinking about a different type of an energy strategy until the Ukraine war. So almost in the aftermath of the Ukraine war, you saw Germany, which was the main exponent of that, keep these fossil fuels under the ground, going to Senegal to try and negotiate deals of how to use Senegal. So you see the kind of double standard. Now, from an African point of view, let's say the African Development Bank's argument is that we believe in climate change, we know that it's a problem. However, we, precisely as you said it, we are entitled to use our resources in the same way as you guys have done, as transition fuel, while we're still, in fact, we are better than you are, because at least, we would be able to use these resources, maybe even sell them, but be able to invest in cleaner technology. So there's that kind of argument. The drawback in all this is that there's very little study that demonstrates whether, for the long term, whether these countries are going to benefit or not. In the short term, of course, you're going to benefit because, windfall cash is going to come in and, you'll be able to use it for whatever. But of course, if we look at the experience across Africa, not many countries have used it for good purposes. If anything, what it has done is it has fueled existing institutional and political problems. The other thing is, if you look at it in the longer term, the IPCC would tell you by 2050 we are expecting gas and oil consumption to come down because the Europeans are drawing down and so forth. These are models that tell us that. What that then means is that less and less fossil fuel or less and less gas is going to be needed because countries are already transitioning into that. At that point, who do you think would be in a position to sell cheaper gas? Qatar or Mozambique or Senegal? The likelihood is Qatar because they have the technology, they have, they've already paid for all their investment, and therefore and not only that, but also they have the resources to be able to withstand the ride through the whatever financial challenges that they're going to be faced with. A country like Senegal, a country like Mozambique, if that happens to be the future, it's only 25 years from now, would be stranded. They would be holding on to investment that is no longer paying. So I think, from a country's perspective, the African perspective, yes, of course, you have the right. The question then is this going to, serve your long-term development needs? The other thing is also, a lot of these countries are exporters. You take Nigeria, for instance, until very recently, 2 years ago or so, they didn't have any refinery capacity. None at all. So what they would do is that they would export basically the oil that they take out of the ground in its raw form, and then import in refined kerosene, petrol, diesel, and so forth. Now you can think about that's really problematic, because what this means is that you are actually handing over the most lucrative value chain to someone else to do the refining for you. So this is the other problem. If they are able to actually capture the entire value chain within their countries and begin to export refined petroleum, well, at the very least, you could say, well, it makes economic sense. But it's complex. Of course, there are those who argue that part of the reason why many countries are not doing that is because they don't have access to the technology. In the same way as in some trade rules, countries are not going to share their most up-to-date technologies and come and build refineries for you, because it has implications for their own business model.
So the point here is that countries like Ethiopia might be morally justified to sort of be hesitant in investing in renewables, but they would be acting against their own economic interest at least in the long term. So that is the point, right? That's an interesting point.
But of course, the specific case of Ethiopia is quite interesting, because this is a country that's been looking for oil and gas ever since, we saw across the sea, you've got Saudi Arabia and others pulling it out and getting rich. So in a sense...
Well, it would be a sort of a digression, but as soon as the new prime minister came to power in 2018, literally on next day or maybe the day after, he said that he had discovered I don't know what kind of gas or oil it was, but of course it came to know, so nothing happened. It was a lie. One of them countless lies he told to the country. But anyway, that's a digression.
But I don't know how true that is. I don't think it is.
I think it was a lie. We now know it was a lie.
But the thing is that Ethiopia is already investing, I mean, in huge amount, slightly interrupted now, but, all the hydro schemes that have been built. Right there, what you have is an electricity system, if managed well, could be, then you have no real reason to be able to look for these other fuels, unless, you're talking about to generate export revenue from it.
Yeah, maybe we'll talk later about how plausible it is, for instance, for districts, or not to say countries, like Tigray, for instance, to invest in renewables, whether it's solar or wind. But you used the term believe in climate change, the implication being that there are people who don't believe in climate change. If we were to sort of steal man, if we were to play the devil's advocate for them, which aspects of the thing you described in terms of climate change is it that they don't believe in?
Well, let me kick off with a little bit of a little story, if you allow me.
Please.
Yeah, there was a celebrated French writer called Des Mots Puissants. This is around the time when the Eiffel Tower was being built in France. And Paris was his home. And he loved that city. But one thing that he hated in that moment was that this Eiffel Tower, this gigantic structure, was going to spoil the image and the view, because you could see the Eiffel Tower from anywhere in Paris. So he hated that actual structure and always talked about it, and really was very angry about that. The only thing is that, you would find him at 11:30 or whatever, whenever it's coffee time, on top of the Eiffel Tower, having his coffee. So people would ask him, what's going on? We thought that, you didn't like this. And his argument is, well, this is the only place where I can sit without having to look at this ugly structure. So what this shows is really a denial of reality, in a sense. So let me kick off with that. I mean, for me, the thing is, how do we define climate change? I mean, it is long-term changes in the average weather patterns of the Earth. Yeah. So yes, of course, climate change also happens naturally over a longer period of time, thousands and millions of years. But the term climate change today is used to refer to human interference, additional, in other words, from the natural. So if you look at the data over the past several thousand years, you see the figure going in terms of, greenhouse gas emissions at a global level, fairly stable. I mean, it goes up and down, but nothing remotely disruptive. What we have seen in the last 50, 60 years is a major spike beyond, what would be deemed a natural phenomenon. So that's the real issue. So I think what you have, of course, the science is complex. I mean, I don't know it in any huge detail. But when you talk to the climate scientists, their argument is that, these people are actually talking about their main sort of area of hiding place is that climate change happens naturally. But then, what we also see is that the data itself, what it tells us is, of course, it happens naturally. But what also is happening, what we are seeing, is that in the last several decades, since the Industrial Revolution, let's say, we've seen that rising up and up and up. That's for me, I just look at the data and make my kind of conclusion. Then, of course, you get caught up in all kinds of conversations around, but how do you know the cloud cover is not affecting climate change? You get into a very detailed sort of conversations which lose the bigger picture. And I do think, a lot of climate denial people are really concentrating on small details without really wanting to accept the bigger picture. The bigger picture is that, human interference is having an effect. And we see it on a fairly regular basis, and you can look at all sorts of evidence, not just the data on global temperatures, but also on ice cores and a whole host of other evidence that points to the fact that since the Industrial Revolution, we are looking at tangible effect that human beings are having on the climate.
What I'm sort of throwing questions at you that I hear people say, so they're not coming from a place of being informed myself. But one of the things that I hear people say, for instance, is that the model that the scientists use to predict is, like all models, partly because it's very complex, is faulty, and therefore that we shouldn't sort of 100% trust the output that it predicts. That is one thing that I hear people say. Another thing that I hear people say in this regard is, yes, climate change is happening, but the solution or the mitigation is not to curtail the use of fossil fuels, because that would be unfair to developing countries, but to seek some sort of engineering solution. Those are some of the things that I hear. And of course, there are people who outright reject that any change is happening. So for instance, they point to a cold winter in Sweden and say, look, there is nothing happening. People are lying to you. I think you remember Trump, was it Trump or another one of his close friends? He held sort of snowball in the Congress and said, this is snow now. It was spring, I think. And that was used as a sort of knockdown argument that climate change wasn't happening. Yeah.
No, it's true. I mean, look, models are models. And as the saying goes, all models are wrong, because what they're trying to do is represent reality. But models are useful in at least, giving us the trends. So we shouldn't accept them as sacrosanct or God-given sort of evidence. But models also, the models that are used they are using evidence from different data points, from physical, from atmospheric. So, they are a mass, and we're getting better and better at it. So if you look at, for instance, the IPCC report in Working Group 3, going back 25 years, the link between human interference and climate change was loosely made. And then as we moved, towards the sixth assessment, which was the last one, and it was much more categorical in the sense that there is evidence that human interference. So I think what that shows you is that the models themselves are getting better and better. Remember also, these are it's not just a single model. We're talking about all sorts of scientific institutions are involved in their own models. And sometimes, they are competitive as well with each other. But one thing, that they all agree, that they all point to is more or less, the same conclusion. Where they vary may be the kind of, how quickly, how fast, on the details of it. In terms of the, what was the question with the US guy again?
Well, they say that nothing is happening, that, in the course of history, there have been times when the globe was cold, there have been moments when it was hot, that this is part and parcel of nature, but that there is nothing unusual. And to say that, they point to places where it gets cold, unusually cold or unusually hot, and they point to historical moments where there was similar sort of weather events, and they draw from that the conclusion that nothing is changing. There is nothing bizarre or unusual happening.
Yeah, no, absolutely. We get that here as well. Where, a few years ago, there was I think it was even when the fifth assessment came out, around that sort of time, in London, you had uninterrupted snow for about 3 weeks or so, 2 or 3 weeks, which basically just ran everything just stopped, including there was even a shortage of food in the supermarkets. I remember going in there and thinking, this country is very much, food dependent from outside. Roads were not working. Basically everything was, it's not like in Sweden, as you guys have the infrastructure to be able to withstand it. My point is that that's true, and this is what happens. That these climate denialists tend to concentrate on isolated moments. But if you look at the entirety of that year, for instance, if you take the past 10, 15 years, 9 out of 10 of those past 10 years have been the hottest on average, and across since we started recording. So in some ways you can push it back by saying, well, you know what, this is an isolate. Of course, when you also have snow in the UK, you would have heat waves happening in Mali, in Senegal, and other places. So what we are also, the other manifestation of climate change is also extreme events of these types. The last 3 to 4 years, for example, in temperatures in Bamako have been running at 45 degrees during the summer, reaching 50 degrees, to the point that they are actually disrupting the type of technology which are quite rudimentary. But nonetheless, the effects are felt very differently from one place to another. But the inability to look at the bigger picture is where the problem lies. And concentrating on just moments and isolated events which are going to happen anyway.
So you mentioned the 1.5 degrees centigrade, and if we were to assume that humanity has failed to do enough in terms of curtailing climate change, and if that change indeed happened, 0.5, what is the doom and gloom that people, again, not to scare off my listeners, but to give us a rough idea, what are we talking about? What happens?
Well, you will have different, the 1.5 is like, the one as a global community shouldn't exceed. That's just, initially it was 2 degrees, then it was put down to 1.5 because there were going to be some regions that would have, huge ramifications for them. So for instance, the African continent is going to hit, when we talk about global 1.5, in Africa, you have to kind of double that almost. So we're talking about 3 degrees, 4 degrees for countries in Africa, on average. And that has all kinds of implications. Number one, you're talking about, the melting of glaciers at the global level. What that means then is, you take Greenland, for instance, today. The whole discussion around Greenland, in some ways, is that, Greenland is losing a lot of its glacier or snow cover. And that exposes Greenland for all sorts of opportunities, one of which is it can be an amazing farmland to be able to produce wheat and so forth in the same way as Ukraine, for instance. But also it exposes all sorts of minerals that Greenland seems to have. Not to mention the fact that the Arctic way becomes much more opened for all sorts of geopolitical advantages. But what that really shows is that it is precisely the warming of the planet that's making Greenland, a lucrative space. That's the good story. That may be the good story. But, once you start hitting 4 degrees, 5 degrees, then forget it. But equally, you can take, other regions as I was saying, in West Africa that are going to be significantly affected. And so if you take, the melting of glaciers, then, you're talking about sea level rise. And there are variations of models tell you different levels. But some of them, the ones that are perhaps conservative, would argue that, places like Alexandria would be underwater. Parts of London would be underwater. So you have that kind of, catastrophic type of an effect. The other thing is, of course, extreme weather. This is a combination of droughts and floodings, that we are seeing quite frequently in many parts of Africa. The other thing is also high, temperatures rising. It means that certain types of crops are going to struggle. So you're going to have to start innovating to make them more drought resistant. So we're going to have to make interferences and have adaptation plans in order to be able to just do what we are doing today in order to, into the future. So the challenges are going to be quite varied. They're going to be very different types of challenges in different parts of the world. Coffee, for instance, we're seeing it even in Ethiopia, where the altitudes are growing, coffee growing areas are going higher and higher in altitude, largely because of the temperature rise has made them quite difficult to be able to, to produce in the same quantity. The same thing is happening in Kenya and Uganda. The thing is that, a lot of these isolated happenings are not recorded that much, particularly the ones that are happening across Africa. One, the research capability is not there. It's not really the most immediate focus because countries are stumbling around trying to make ends meet for today. But there are, when you're talking about adapting to climate change, it's happening, and farmers and small farmers are doing it in their own way. The only thing is that there is a limit in terms of what they would be able to achieve by themselves.
Well, interesting. You mentioned conservatives. Some of the fringe ideas that you hear from them is that we shouldn't try to stop climate change because that is playing with nature. It's going to happen whether we do one thing or another. And they say that instead we should have plan B. And one of the plan Bs they discuss is, for instance, what is the word they use, to go and, plan for instance, to go to Mars, for instance. That is one thing that when Earth becomes inhospitable. So that is, some interesting wacky ideas, you might say, that you hear from those corners. But if we could sort of.
But on that issue, one thing is also, this kind of discovering other planets and what have you. One thing, you could say could be interesting is that there are a lot of mineral deposits up there that one can bring back to Earth and use them to be able to produce solar panels and what have you. There's quite a lot of debate now whether you have places like DRC, which produces 80% of the cobalt that you need for all sorts of, for the digitization world of the future, as well as solar panels and wind turbines and so forth. 80% of it comes from DRC. If DRC was to decide, I'm not going to sell, well, they can't, but if they did, then the world goes at standstill. So I think, what you have up there is there's also a competition that's taking place in terms of, accessing resources that don't really have any ownership, in a sense, beyond the idea of occupying Mars, in other words, which seems to be
a bit fanciful, yeah. Well, it's interesting that you mentioned solar panels, Yacob, because that was what I was going to ask you next. So that's a good segue. When I was the last time I was in Tigray, I visited a startup in Mekelle, and they were trying to invest in the sort of production of solar panels, and they presented to me and to my friend the challenge they were facing, but I didn't quite understand the technical difficulties they were facing because I don't have expertise. But what I would like to ask you is, because you mentioned minerals and the need to bring minerals from Mars or from wherever. But generally, what are the challenges? Because one of the sort of religious views, you could say, that people have in Tigray, for instance, is that Tigray would be at a competitive advantage when it comes to producing, not producing, but relying on solar panels, for instance, for its electrification. But what are the challenges there?
In terms of producing solar cells, not so much panels. The solar cells.
So maybe you could explain the differences. I'm not sure I understand the difference.
Yeah.
Roughly, I seem like a deluded idea, but yeah.
The solar cells. You will need a solar engineer to be able to explain in more detail. But the solar cells themselves to produce them is quite, number one, is energy intensive for that. Not only that, but also you need some really high advanced level of semiconductor technologies work. Anywhere in Africa at the moment, outside of maybe South Africa, is a fairy tale thing. So you have that. So the panels, rather the cells themselves, are the ones that are put together, assembled into a panel. And the panel gives you whatever voltage and current. You can assemble it in any way you want. So the assembly of that, or the panel itself, not the cells, but the panel, the boxy kind of thing that you see on roofs, for instance, each of those is known to be the panel. That can be done because that requires only metal work and, very basic type of engineering work. So if you're talking about Muslim engineering people, there's no reason why they can't do that. So what Tigray can do is obviously importing the cells and be able to assemble the panels in the way that work, that's in demand within the country, within the region. And it's been done. Zimbabwe used to do it in the 80s and 90s. So it's not a complicated process, but just needs some very good basic sort of engineering. And yes, it can be done. And then, you can assemble these panels in ways that you wire them together to be able to produce your electricity to whatever voltage and current you need. So that's the difference. But I think if you're talking about the kind of the very basic component of it, that requires quite a lot of innovation, and quite a lot of manufacturing capability. For instance, the guys in what is it called? The METEC, is it? The military.
Maytech, yeah.
METEC, yeah.
I think it's
Because they were
been disbanded. Yeah, it's been disbanded now. It's
yeah.
no longer exists.
It no longer, yeah. But I mean, they had a major sort of work to. But my sense is that was also an assembly rather than cell engineering.
I think I had lost you for a moment. I don't know if it's my connection, but yeah, it's all right now. Yeah, but when we're at the Yacob, if we were sort of hypothetical, because I'm trying to understand the sort of the devil in the details when it comes to solar energy, because it seems to be something that a lot of people in Tigray take seriously.
Yeah.
If we were to assume that we have enough solar panels somehow, whether we imported them or assembled them in Tigray, would solar-based electricity be enough to electrify Tigray, for instance, hypothetically speaking?
Absolutely. It can be done. Absolutely, it can be done. All you have to do is just go to Germany, the German rooftop program, where you have, hundreds and thousands of people who decided to put, rooftop. But of course, it needed government policy and government intervention, and they created the regulatory instruments such as feed-in tariff. So I have a friend in Germany who doesn't draw from the government any kind of energy. I have a friend in Sweden who does the same thing. In Sweden, solar panel I'm talking about.
You see the sun for one day a year in Sweden.
Yeah. But what you need is light, and not so much sun. And I mean, the German program is. I mean, I can send you some of the data. It is quite impressive. The rooftop level, but also of course, if you go to places like Spain, or I mean, of course, if you go to China, they and India, they are kind of laying down some amazing solar installations. Sometimes the problem may be land. This is where you have to negotiate. Because I mean, I know there is one, for instance, in India and several others in China that run for, by 10 kilometers against 10 kilometers. Now, Tigray has that kind of land, So, for instance, rooftop level, community level, industry level, for them to be able to produce for their own, perhaps even feeding it into whatever the grid is, it absolutely can be done. I think we should do some kind of get some modelers to do that. So the 100%.
So, but Yacob, you mentioned grid, right? So you say grid. So all right. But is it also conceivable that people might have sort of standalone electricity sources if they were to have their own separate? Maybe this is very, very basic stuff that I'm asking you, but if households in Tigray, especially in the villages, if they were to have their own panels, for instance, is that reasonable to expect that they might rely on their panels for their own electricity consumption, for instance? Does it have to be a grid, in other words?
Absolutely can be done. Doesn't have to be a grid. The only thing is that, the grid, what the slight advantage, if it's a good grid, you have is that some people will be using more electricity and others less. Also the time difference. So, you might be able to kind of smooth the consumption across different users. But, you can still have a mini grid system. And there were quite a lot of health centers in Tigray were operating like that, with solar panels and batteries, until the monstrous Eritrean soldiers came and took it. So, I mean, many of the rural areas, schools, as well as clinics were operating with that. So you can have it, at that level. But if you're talking about, sharing electricity across different types of users, say, for instance, industries may not need it all the time, in which case then, And maybe you could also add some wind capability. I mean, of course, Mekelle is just blowing all the time. That's also why, you have the wind turbines, which never worked, which is the most absurd type of investment one can come across.
Why did it not work?
But the wind regime.
Why did it fail?
I don't know. I mean, when I first saw it, I thought to myself, well, this is a bit strange because it's two blades, and the two blade is what you use for what's known as cutting speed, which is when the wind turbine starts rotating. That's when it starts producing electricity. But if you have less turbines, what it means, you have less drag. So it means then, you need a lot more wind to be able to run it. If you have a 5 turbine, blade turbine, then it's easier to start. The only thing is that, it doesn't reach the same sort of rated level of speed as the two-blade one. The two-blade one could be, you can start it at let's say 5 meters per second wind speed, and it can blow up to 14 or 15. Whereas the other one, you may start it at 3, but it reaches peak level of production at 7 or 8. So it's you need to match your wind turbines depending on your wind regime. My feeling was that the two turbine in Mekelle was just ridiculous, because that's more for temperate weather type of work. So, but then I think the part of the reason why it didn't quite work had other reasons, which are other types of technical and contractual problems that came in the way and so forth. But it is possible, eastern Tigray, there's a lot of wind that blows, because in some ways it's part of the kind of the wind regime that Djibouti, for instance, has got ridiculous amount of wind. I was doing some work there a while back, and they were so concentrated on geothermal. Geothermal, you have to dig, you have to test, you have to, you need about 10 years before you start using it. And I remember talking to the minister, I'm like, because I saw the data, and this is comparable to anywhere on Earth. So if you go up, 50 meters, you've got, baseline type of energy, meaning constant energy throughout the year almost. So I was asking him, I said, well, why are you wasting your time on geothermal? Because that's going to take you a long time to dig. It's going to be much bigger investment. Whereas with these ones, you could do it within a year. You could have a fully functional wind farm. He said, no, the private sector will come, he said. I said, well, next door you have Ethiopia, the other one is Kenya.
Your connection is cutting in and out, Yacob. I don't know whether it's from my side, the problem.
Is it from my side?
I mean, it's good enough, it's all right, but there are times when it cuts out for a short while. But I think it's all right now. Yeah, but you mentioned, you said that you always knew the wind turbines in Mekelle were going to fail, and that somehow doesn't surprise me, because my observation in Tigray is that a lot of things are done in a haphazard way without doing enough research and the meticulous work that needs to go into those types of projects. So maybe that could be the reason that people haven't properly done their homework. But I feel as though, a lot of people, including you, should have a conversation about this. I have a friend of mine who has done a lot of research in smart grid. Research is sort of from the vantage point of security and safety of smart grid, and you have a different vantage point. And I feel like you guys should have conversation about that, because this is such a critical and important subject. But while we are on the issue of Tigray and in relation to the war, Yacob, one of the things that has happened is a whole lot of sort of ecosystem was destroyed during the war, and sort of it has been ignored. I mean, the only thing that I could remember is another friend of mine, a researcher, maybe you might know him, who has written about the damage that the war has done to the ecosystem. But otherwise, the focus has been on the human life, which, again, understandably, is justified. But that is one of the things that happened, and I wonder why it is that not many people are talking about it. The destruction of forestry, the destruction of other potential source of clean energy and all that. That's something that you sense as well. The sort of not giving attention to that aspect of the war.
Yeah, I mean, I think, of course, I think the focus on the social aspect is totally understandable, because that's the most palpable thing that you can, it is the one that you feel almost immediately, the kind of the violence of it and the way in which it was designed to disfigure and destroy the social fabric of Tigray. That's precisely what it was. So I think, people are, I guess, still in some kind of level of shock. Children are not going to school, or their schools have been destroyed and so forth. So that's, I think, as you said, it's understandable that people are focusing on that. But I think the other thing, obviously, is that, a lot of people have been documenting the environmental destruction that we've seen. People like Aster Christos, Eminet Nagash, LA, from Magala University in Meru, Taklai Manut, based in Olda Mikael, based in Manchester, who's been a real amazing voice. But also some other colleagues, people like Jan Nissen in Belgium.
Yeah, good that you mentioned them, Yacob. I had forgotten them actually, to my bad. So good that you mentioned the people who have been doing amazing work on the environmental damage the war has brought. Yeah.
People like, I think, Henrik Schult, that's also another person. But so many others. I'm sure I've left out many names, and they've been working as a unit, working as a team, and really documenting it in as much detail as possible, using geospatial data and so forth. But I think that's the beginning of it, isn't it? But the challenges that people are faced with day-to-day type of challenges, and unfortunately these environmental issues tend to be symptoms of a deeper problem than so that people can focus on them. I mean, there's been a massive change in terms of woody vegetation. I was just reading some of that stuff not long ago, done by these colleagues. A lot of these areas resulted in huge land restoration challenges, for the future. But also, one thing that you could argue is that even in the best of times, Tigray is somewhat of a fragile area. But a lot of restoration work. For me, that's the key as well, that the livelihoods issue and the ecosystem damage is not something that you can separate in the context of Tigray, because, those two go hand in hand. Not to mention the fact that, the reason why, we were talking about restoration some years ago, not long ago, people like George Monbiot, has written on The Guardian about it, highlighting these issues. The human as well as the environmental issues cannot be separated. They are one and the same. So I wish, we could sort of figure out, what can be done in terms of doing livelihoods work, but also linking it, to ecosystems and what have you. So I suppose, people have to kind of prioritize in terms of, what is, when you're seeing people being hurt, environmental harm becomes secondary. But when you talk about the longer term, there has to be a different approach that we should be thinking about.
But isn't it interesting? I totally understand. You say that environmental issues of secondary or tertiary issues when it comes to international organizations and all that. But that is not the impression you would get if you saw the meetings and the conferences, the big event that they hold about climate change, renewable energy and all that. You would get the impression that, these people would be concerned by wars in Africa that destroy and lay waste to whole ecosystems and vegetation and all that. But that doesn't happen, at least not to my liking. And there seems to be a degree of, double standard or cognitive dissonance among the big organizations. And I wonder why. What is the incentive system that makes them say the right things in meetings and conferences, but completely fail to take any action? What is the sort of incentive structure or lack of it thereof?
Well, I think for me it was, highly telling what had happened during the active conflict and beyond. And then I think, all of our assumptions have been shattered in that sense, when it comes to the international community. There's no such a thing. There are only interests. So very quickly you could see that European Union, more or less, pushing aside, even, taking out some of the personalities that were actually saying, look, there's something seriously bad going on here. Yeah. So those were the people who were pushed aside in favor of finding some kind of a favorable arrangement with the government in Addis. So I think, there's politics that's at play. And of course, if you take a very bird's eye view, I suppose, on politics, then, you realize that it's also, Europe is also struggling. The French, for instance, in West Africa, are being pushed out. So I think there are these concerns that there are geopolitical fallouts that they don't want to face. And a country like Ethiopia hosts the African Union. You have the African Union also, in favor of even the language that they were using was one of hostility and complete sort of negation of the type of atrocities that were happening. So there is, you have to be cynical that there is that big politics going on. And unfortunately, this is also something that has infected a lot of the international institutions, even at the UN level. You had, the then UNDP, well, he still is, I think, lead, who basically was kind of bankrolling, some of the institutions, so-called, democracy building or nation building type of institutions when all this was happening. So there's that problem we have to face. And in some ways, we see that also in other conflicts. If you are weak and these international institutions are going to line up with those that they can continue to work with. And of course, the international system itself only, functions with nation states. They only talk to nation states, and that was the other difficulty that Tigray had. It didn't have the voice. And then, of course, the internal division as well, that doesn't help, because you basically fragment your narrative. You fragment your stories, and those critical issues around human, rights and and the atrocities tend to be kind of swept under the carpet conveniently, so that you can sort of play politics. I've become extremely cynical, Taflai, after this, and then also after seeing what's happening in the Middle East. I'm like, wow, okay, this is the type of world that we are entering into, and it does require quite a lot of different type of thinking in terms of what to do next.
Yeah, I think the cynicism is more than understandable, and it's not just you. I think it's a lot of us, especially actually those of us who grew up sort of indoctrinated by the TPLF, that there is such a thing called mesmer. I don't know if you one form that understanding takes is that there are lines that people wouldn't cross, whether it's international bodies or countries or governments.
Yeah.
So that the expectation, interestingly, you say that our expectations were shattered by the Tigray war, and absolutely, because one of the expectations was that when Abiy Ahmed took a sledgehammer to the Ethiopian constitution and invaded Tigray and all that, we thought that would alarm a lot of people in the international organizations and governments, and that they would come and tell him to stop. And we believed that because we believed everybody else believed in mesmer, in red lines, and red lines that if you cross them, you will pay a price. But there was no such thing. And the first 2 or 3 months of the war, from late 2020 to well into 2021, I was in a constant state of shock at the lack of action and response from the international community, because I had expected them to act. So I totally understand if you are totally cynical now about international bodies, but maybe we'll talk about that, about the international response to the Tigray war and to the Tigray crisis or paralysis now towards the end. Because I want to talk to you about your own journey. I think a lot of people would learn from your own academic journey, to be specific, from Ethiopia to London through the US. Tell us a little bit how you ended up where you are now.
Well, I was a young, I suppose, you could say it was a fairly sheltered kind of journey. So the family moved to Rome, to Italy, and I was in just entering 11th grade, I think, at the time, and this is like in the middle of major, the Derg sort of crisis, and I remember saying to them, "You guys go, I'll stay here." Everyone wanted to leave, and you're 15 or 14 or whatever, and you're already just beginning to sort of form bonds with friends and whatever, girlfriends and things. And I just didn't want to go. Anyway, so we moved to Italy. That's where I finished my high school. and then went to the US to start my bachelor's degree in geology, which is, I had the fascination for the natural sciences and a kind of a deep curiosity about about the Earth's history, and kind of always drawn to understand, why volcanoes happen and earthquakes, those sorts of curiosities. So I went to a small liberal arts college in Indiana, the US, called Earlham College, which is a Quaker college. Quakers are interesting people in the sense that
They say they are peaceful, among other things.
Exactly. And I remember some of them would go to South Africa and come back and talk to us about a peaceful way of resolving this. And there were a whole bunch of Africans there who were just looking at each other and thinking, how do you resolve this peacefully? The guy, these guys are, smashing up people. So anyway, but it was an interesting one in many other ways. The way the Quakers operated with, for instance, student government, you cannot have a majority rule. You can only have a consensus. So I remember one year I was serving as, within the student government, and some meetings would go on until 5 o'clock in the morning just to persuade one person. So unless everyone agrees, we have no decision. So, it was a fascinating sort of journey. And so I did my geology degree there, did my, and began to be sort of interested in energy as a kind of follow-up direction. Then I came to the UK in Manchester to do my MSc in energy technology. So that was combining, the kind of the technical, the resource, as well as the sort of social science aspect of it, economics and things like that. And of course, by then you've come to the end of the road. So and this was also a time when jobs for overseas people were quite difficult for some reason in those days. Maybe Thatcher was in power at the time, so maybe that's the reason. And then I was contemplating what to do next, and I was having a chat with one of the professors, and he said, well, why don't you do a PhD? I'm like, I haven't really thought about that. That seems like a very long journey. Anyway, he talked me into it. He said, well, what have we got to do? Your other option is just to go to Ethiopia. And that didn't seem like a nice one at the time anyway. So I went to Scotland. And at the time, there was a professor by the name John Twidell. In fact, we were using his textbook, and I went to Scotland to join his PhD program. I managed to get the grant which is an interesting story in its own way. Because I was living with a group of friends. One of them we still are, meet each other quite often. This Palestinian friend who is like, very adventurous. And he said, how are you going to finance it? I said, I don't know. He says, well, why don't you just go and knock on doors? Knock on whose doors? Knock on, grants. There are all kinds of, trust funds here and there. So I remember taking the bus, with 20 addresses, going into London with my topic area nicely laid out and nicely typed. In those days, you had to type it. You didn't have, computer to rely on. Anyway, and I remember going to each of these places and thinking, this is just a waste of time, really, because I'm going nowhere with this. Because they're all polite, nice people. You knock on doors and you say, I'm from such and such a place and I would like to do, I'm looking for a grant. And then they're nice. Oh, okay, very interesting. They will take your thing. Would you like a cup of tea? And I remember I was in North London about to take my bus, and there was just one left. So I thought, what do I do? Do I go or not? Do I go? Anyway, I'm here, so let me go. And that was a jackpot. So I got in and spoke to, what was his name? Jim Kemp. That was the person in the... So we had a long, really interesting discussion. And then he said, look, I'll put in a good word for you with David Astor. Like, who's David Astor? So anyway, 2 weeks later, I was invited to go and see David Astor. It turns out David Astor owned the Observer newspaper, basically the Guardian offshoots. Quite a liberal, influential family. Later on, I find out also that he was supportive of Mandela. He's the one who used to send him books to South Africa and so forth. And his son was also quite close, it seemed like, with the EPLF. So he had a regional sort of interest as well. Anyway, so that's how I managed to get the grant. And so it's always nice, to, knock on doors and your effort yield some fruit. So I went to Scotland, and it was a totally disastrous move because it turned, John Twyddle was not a nice person. As soon as I walked in, I realized I should have gone in first, to have a proper interview. As soon as I walked into the office, I realized I made the wrong mistake because the entire community of PhDs, and it was just loads of them, were, subservient foreigners, mainly from Asia. Totally, with some of them I'm still in touch, but really, this guy was like the king, emperor. All the papers, they would publish, these guys are some of them are like very, very sort of accomplished, technical and all of that. And his name would always go first. So, there was automatically a tension that I had to sort of overcome. And I remember one morning, when I came in at around 11 o'clock or so. Is this interesting story or
very
am
interesting?
I rambling on?
No,
yeah?
That's exactly what I wanted to hear. Yeah.
Okay.
Well, not the ordeal that I wanted to hear, but the story.
Okay. At 11 o'clock, I'm a PhD student. Come on. And he says to me, "You can't do this." I said, "What do you mean you can't do this?" He says, "Well, you have to be here at 8:30 or 9 o'clock." I said, "But I was working last night on my thesis." He's like, "I don't care. I want everyone to be here at 9 until 5 or 6. Whoa. I said, "Okay, this is not what I signed up to." So I began there's no way I'm going to last here for 4 years. This is not going to work. And so I went to London, spoke to David Astor, told him about it, so that, my funding didn't get interrupted. So I wanted to move it. So I got in touch with Professor Lionel Cliff. I knew him through my family. Lionel Cliff was I don't know if you have, he was head of politics department, a real gentleman, and he was also he's one of the founders of the ROPE journal, a review of African political economy. And he taught at Dar es Salaam University with Walter Rodney, and he comes with a very strong sort of anti-colonial pedigree in his intellect, and also quite close to the liberation movements in Eritrea and Tigray as well. Anyway, so he got me in contact with Sally McGill, was a fantastic scholar at geography, because my work could only fit in geography because I was looking at resource assessment of renewable energy in Ethiopia, in the Horn of Africa. And just before I moved, I meet David, John Twyddle in the corridor. And I'm about literally the last day, and he knew that I was going, and he's trying to make conversation, and he says to me, where are you going? And I couldn't think of anything. The only thing that came, I swear to you, the only thing that came to mind was Bolivia. I said, "I'm going to Bolivia." He says, "What are you going to do in Bolivia?" "Just, travel around and, that's it." So he still thinks I'm in Bolivia, maybe. Anyway, and so I went to Leeds. So I had this wonderful sort of guidance from Lionel and Sally McGill. Sally McGill unfortunately passed away in the tsunami in Thailand some years back. Her and her daughter passed away in that one. But she was an amazing scholar, and there was also another supervisor, Francis Drake. Anyway, so that's what happened. So I moved to Leeds and then did my PhD there in, again, energy systems specific to Ethiopia, and also quite a bit on Tigray. So I did some field work in Tigray as well at the time. And in those days, we were talking about 95 or so. So there was quite a lot of, the grass was still quite high, meaning that, this was a period of change and lots of commotion, but still managed to do some, I think for me, it was an interesting reconnection with the Tigray, nonetheless. And then from that, I moved so I started working at Birmingham Polytechnic as sort of, co-managing the new research center called Sustainability Research Center. And then 2 years later, I moved to Are we disconnected?
To you see it? No, I'm.
Are we okay?
I hear you. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And then I went to University of Surrey, spent 12 years around that there with in the Center for Environmental Strategy, worked with some amazing scholars. One of them, the person who set it up, is Professor Roland Clift. He's was one of the leading people, still is, on life cycle assessment, which is something that Professor Getachew is Getachew is a world leader in that field. But Roland was one of the sort of early exponents of that. And another one was Tim Jackson, good friend, but also an insanely very important scholar who wrote the book Prosperity Without Growth, which is a fairly widely circulated book around the problem related to growth. Growth is the problem in terms of, looking at sustainability, security of resources, and well-being. There I set up my job was really, of course, as a junior academic, but also setting up the master's program, and I ran it for 8-9 years, which was thankless kind of job. And then in 2010 I moved to the African Climate Policy Center in UNECA. So I moved to Addis for 2.5 years or so, where we worked on very much, policy related to Tigray. Are you there? This feels a bit lonely.
I think I had lost you briefly. I'm back. I'm back. Do you hear me?
I can hear you.
Continue from where I think it was just a few seconds that I was out.
Okay. Yeah, from Surrey I moved to Addis. So I was in the team that set up the African Climate Policy Center at the Economic Commission for Africa, UNECA. So we did a lot of policy related work, and that was a pretty adventurous time where, some of my own kind of academic assumptions and ideas were sort of tested in the real world. And it was a tough place as well, where the team consisted of Yuba Sokona, who in the last round he was IPCC vice chair. Vice chair, correct. Dr. Seleshi Bekele, he later on became Minister of Water and Energy in Ethiopia. So this was the core team. And so my task was energy, Seleshi's work was on water. So it's a productive time, but also difficult to try and navigate this international institution, because we had some new ideas, and a lot of people liked it outside of the UN, but the UN itself was pretty challenging in terms of trying to get these ideas off the ground. One of which, for instance, was setting up a fellowship program where we would bring in 12 fellows, which we did in the first year, and Africans, because one of the things that we insisted on is that it should be Africa-led enough, and that we have to build our own team rather than rely on consultants, because every UN institution was relying on consultants. We said, no, we need a team here that's going to carry the weight forward. It had decent money as well in it. So we couldn't recruit more, the professional staff fast enough. So we decided, let's move with the fellows. A couple of them I knew from my PhD students, called them up and said, what are you doing come here. What are you doing in Manchester or in Surrey? And so forth. So we managed to pull together, 12 people, most of whom we knew relatively. And of course they had to go through the sort of interview process and all that. So I began to produce a lot of good work. But the UN is a tough place where, we couldn't, we just had so many bureaucratic hurdles. And then, we also had, we just didn't understand the institution itself. I don't know, but, the executive secretary didn't like us for some reason. Part of it is just some people were, pushing information which was, these guys are all researchers, they're not real policymakers, that kind of thing. And he wasn't really paying much attention. And yet, it was also a very high impact, the donors were kind of putting in a lot of work, emphasis behind it. My recollection was that in one of the climate meetings, the climate, at the COP in Durban, so we were asked by the African Union, this team, to organize those 2 weeks, an Africa pavilion. I've never worked so hard in my life like that, where we wrote all the concept notes, you name it, got all the speakers for 2 solid weeks of engagements. And then at the end, the final session, and I remember on stage there was the African Development Bank lead, African Union head, Nicholas Stern, who was one of the big professors at the time on climate change. I think Mary Robinson, who was the ex-president of Ireland, and Meles Zenawi. And I remember Meles saying, we thank this institution at at ECA for organizing this event, for doing such a good work, but whatever. And the only person who just didn't say anything was our own boss, the executive of ECA. So I thought, well, this is... Anyway, so I spent, those two and a half very fruitful years, and then came back to Surrey, and then joined UCL as Professor of Energy and Development Policy, and I've been there for now about 10 years.
Well, that is one hell of a journey, young people might put it, and I love that your face lights up when you speak about your journey. It must have been quite an experience, and a lot of the points, a lot of the sort of ordeals that you had to endure are relatable to me as well.
Yes.
But interesting that you studied in Italy as well. I don't know if you know Isaias Yurgam. He interviewed him about a book that he wrote in tribute to his father. The title of the book is The Tigrayan Electrician. A wonderful, wonderful account of his father's life.
Yeah.
But Isaias himself was born in, I don't know if you two would be sort of in the same age range. He might have been in Italy at the same time. I'm just trying to work out, but my brain isn't as bright as now. But anyway, he was born in Asmara, and then he had to leave Eritrea, and he moved to Italy, and he studied in Italy. But then he had to, I don't quite remember the exact reason, but he had to move Italy, and he moved to the UK. And he faced a lot of problems getting residence permit and getting into university and all that. But anyway, somehow he studied, and then he moved to the US, whereas you from the US moved to the, so he sort of crisscrossed. But a lot of the stories sort of align. But I too studied in Italy. So if it had been a different time, we might have crossed paths, because in 20, but much, much later. So in 20, I think.
Yes.
I don't know what happened. But
Probably bandwidth.
I think we can continue from. Yeah, but I was saying that I too studied in Italy. I don't know if you had heard that part.
I heard that bit. Yeah, that's where you got cut off.
Yeah, but no. All that to say, I found your story interesting, not least because it also reminded me of the story of Isaias. And I was just wondering if it was a thing for Tigrayans and Ethiopians maybe in general then to go to Italy to study. Was there sort of a trend, or what was happening?
Yeah, I mean, I think there was certainly, and Isaias' story is unique though. That's a spectacular story.
Oh, it's extraordinary. Even the way he was sort of whisked out of Asmara, out of danger. The way his mother dared and did something extraordinary to send her son out into safety.
Absolutely.
It was so powerful. Yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely amazing. And and he was 15, 16 when he was, and
yeah.
I mean, I have an 18-year-old, and it's a different level of maturity.
Yeah.
He was
It's
a
extraordinary
man.
what Tigrayan parents,
Yeah,
the length to which they go to
to protect them.
ensure the safety of their children. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. It's an insanely incredible story, but also, the way in which he succeeded through all that madness that he was going through, and then, to also, on top of that, maintaining his humanity is just unbelievable.
Yeah.
It's a really inspiring story that, yeah.
Yeah.
We never met. Although it looks like we were in the same. We were in Rome, in the same place. In my case, as I was saying, it was more of a sheltered sort of journey in the sense that my father was working at the FAO, this UN agency, so totally different in that sense. Yes, we would, we'd have lots of visitors, especially Tigrayans, but by and large, yeah, it's a different. In Isaiah's case, he had to. I mean, that story about him and how he he used to yearn, to go to class, and yet he was being prevented for one reason or another, and then he would team up with some of the good students, to and actually sit his exams on the basis. I mean, that just takes quite a spectacular human being, honestly.
Yeah.
But you are in Italy as well.
No, I'm in Sweden.
No, but you went past through Italy.
Yeah, I did. Yeah, I lived there for 5 years. Although to my utter shame, I didn't take Italian seriously, and I don't speak Italian, and that is something I'm going to regret for the rest of my life.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I
but
was in Rome on Monday, and I hadn't been to Italy for a while. But my Italian is absolutely atrocious, awful.
could you just about sort of manage?
I can understand quite well, reasonably well. But my problem is that my wife is Spanish.
All
And
right.
so
So
just
you
the two
speak
languages
Spanish.
are so
You just speak
similar.
Spanish, right?
I speak better Spanish than an Italian. So now
But are Italian and Spanish not mutually intelligible?
they are. And so, I mean, for the Spanish, the little bit of Italian I knew helped a lot.
All right.
But I need to sort of master one of the languages, polish it up so that it sits comfortably on its own, and then move to the other. So I've
Yeah.
got these 2, 3 languages that are just, they're not good enough for anything.
Yeah.
French is the other one. So anyway, yeah,
One at a time. One at a
one at
time.
a time.
Yeah.
I'm sure you speak but better Italian than me, I'm sure.
No, it's completely disappeared. The little Italian I spoke is completely disappeared. I think I suppose the reason is that I didn't have the awareness I have of languages now then, so
Yeah.
that I didn't take it seriously. As long as I had friends from Ethiopia and from
Yeah.
international friends as well,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
we spoke English or Tigrinya among ourselves, and there wasn't the. I mean, I say that is foolish to say, but there wasn't the incentive to study Italian.
Yeah, yeah.
But of course, in hindsight, I know that was a completely, mistaken understanding of language. I had, we had an opportunity, and we should have taken it seriously.
Yeah.
But I made up for my failure to learn Italian by teaching myself Swedish. So I'm fine. I'm more than fine.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, it's interesting. More than interesting, it's good that you shared as the difficult journeys that people who do PhDs, especially people who come from different cultures. I think among some people there is this mistaken impression that PhD and academia in general is a plain sailing, but it is not. It is it's a painful experience. It's a difficult journey sometimes. It's a journey that is worth it, that is rewarding, as you said. But it could be very difficult, and I think it's good that people have that awareness before they embark on such projects, because it's a serious investment and commitment of one's life as well. PhD.
Yeah. It's a lonely journey as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's like 3-4 years, whatever, however many years it takes. It's just something that sits in your head, and it basically occupies you. You can't really think outside of it. I don't know how you managed to do it with with this craziness going on in Tigray.
Well, I mean, my PhD, I was supposed to have finished by now, but I haven't finished it. So I'm not a good example actually of this.
Yeah, but I mean, but even to continue in that sort of state, it's insane. It's just I just don't know. I don't think I would have been able to do it. I think I would have.
But the fact that it has proven very difficult for me has given me a renewed sense of appreciation for people who finish their PhD. So that is the one positive effect of the fact that it has proven very difficult for me. But finally, Yacob, I'm sure we're going to talk about those things another time. Maybe I'm going to have you on another time. But for now, I think we would be remiss if we didn't talk a little bit about Tigray. I wonder what you feel from afar, from London, when you see the absolute shambles in Tigray. I mean, I don't know what I would want you to talk about, but if you have some sort of brainstorming thoughts, please feel free to share them. Yeah.
I mean, I just feel. I remember reading something, the phrase, the old is dying, the young is struggling to be born. Now is the time for monsters. It just describes that at the moment. That's how I feel, that, after such a brutal conflict which has taken so many lives and so much of Tigray, I expected a different type of leadership. I expected people to learn. I expected people to walk away if they have to. Because there's just, you can't justify playing power politics in this kind of a state. I just cannot understand what is the driving force. Obviously it's power. Obviously it's a sense of, this is mine and, back off kind of thing. So it's almost like, no lessons have actually been drawn from this experience. What I was expecting was that there would be a renewed sense of purpose and unity and, a different way of looking at, at Tigray, but also the region at large. And it's as if, this hasn't happened. And yet, what has happened is completely unprecedented. Completely beyond any kind of understanding and imagination. So I feel guilty because I'm not making any kind of active contributions at this stage, but because I don't know how, I really don't know how. Apart from supporting those who need support in any way. At the same time, I have such appreciation for the young, people like Rita, those selfless people who've gone in and tried to heal the pain for people who have experienced unimaginable pain and suffering. And I do think, that somehow, you see, what I was expecting was that there would be a new breed of leaders that would emerge and would sketch out a different type of future, a different type of politics. But we've gone straight back into the same kind of thing. Those outside of that being discounted, but also, this kind of renewing, relationships with those who have subjected your people to such misery and despair. So it's the only thing I feel right now is just a sense of and to some extent, unable to think of what is there that we can do. Of course, so in a sense, maybe that's the thing that needs to happen. I sincerely believe anymore that, any kind of hope and change cannot come from the top. It just can't. It has to be a much more grassroots type of driven type of change. But how do you do that? Because I just don't think that there is the type of leadership that is in a position to renew itself. So it has to come from outside of that. And I don't know how do you achieve that? How do you create that when you are being stifled, when you are being pushed down? Because even the possibility to be able to exercise meaningful kind of politics is not even there. It doesn't seem like it. How was it, when you were there? It must have been quite despairing.
Oh, it's very dispiriting. It's very
Yeah.
dispiriting. And there's such a huge disconnect between what the people want and what the politicians seem to be prioritizing. And you can't reconcile that difference. And you can't understand why there would be such a huge difference between what the people want and what the politicians find relevant and interesting. And I think the sentiments and frustrations you are expressing, Yacob, are shared by a lot of people, especially those of us from outside seem to have an idea of what the priority should be. And it would be commonsensical to say that the priority after going through genocide would be reconstruction and rehabilitation. And you would expect that party politics would be sort of suspended, or at least it wouldn't be given the heft and weight that is being given now, the feuding, the infighting. But that is for us. And if you go to Tigray, to Mekelle, and speak to politicians, they have a completely different set of priorities. It's as though nothing had happened. It's as though it should be normal politics where, parties are vying for to be heard, to be listened. It's just normal politics, the kind of politics that you would see in the UK, for instance, between the Conservatives and Labour. And that is something that I can't make sense of. So it's very difficult. But also the other point you raise is that you have some sort of rough ideas about what ought to be done and all that, but there simply is no way of making people listen to that because they are the people in Mekelle. And in a way it sounds a bit condescending to say that, because here I'm in Stockholm and judging politicians in Mekelle because it's very tough there. But in another sense, they don't seem to be listening to outside voices and to more sensible voices, no doubt. And I think that is the sort of the intellectual problem, as far as I'm concerned, is how is it that we can make the TPLF people, for instance, who control the bureaucracy, how is it that we could make them susceptible to new ideas? And I simply don't have the solution to that.
Which is why I was saying, there's no way, the only thing is that, you can try and do things, because I'm not even sure about the other political parties either. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
In so many ways, they even feel like, different sides of the different coin. The narrative is, more or less the same. The language is the same. Even during the war, I was even thinking, the complaint, coming from that side, and I'm like, what are you doing? Why can't you go and demonstrate something else? This is a moment to be practical, to be counted. You know that there is a famine that's looming. Is there anything that you're doing to solve that? Are you planting? Are you getting your hands dirty? Instead of just sitting in a coffee shop and then complaining, So I think we are in that sort of situation where a lot of at least that's my observation, from a kind of a distance, as you said, but maybe more things are happening. But I just felt that the political class is completely alien to the reality that's unfolding. I mean, it's almost like, I don't know, if you remember, during the first few weeks of when things were just falling apart, remember, when, would come out with his blue gloves, and I'm thinking, is this guy for real? And then immediately afterwards as well, in a tie, back again. So it's like, what sort of world do these people live in? This is a moment of enormous crisis, and here you are, playing politics. I mean, that's what it was. The blue gloves were to represent, I am responsible, I'm in command, I'm responsible, I'm the grown-up one here, look at me, and I think, the same, obviously he's not as, he's more refined, should I say, Getachew, but the rhetoric is more or less the same, in a sense. They're two sides of the same coin. So it's really unfortunate what's going on. I don't know. I mean, is there anything we can do through Tighat and other organizations? Is there some kind of pressure that we can apply from, I think, GSTS is a little bit too much, of a top-down thing, where there is a kind of an intellectual class which isn't, which thinks that it can solve the problem in a top-down way, but I'm just not convinced.
Yeah, well, I think maybe we will need to pick up on this conversation and continue another time about Tigray. Thank you for the time today. I think a lot of our listeners are going to enjoy and find it educational, which is what I want. I especially the aspect of your sort of academic journey from Ethiopia to Italy to the US to the UK is fascinating. Thank you very much, Professor, for today. And we're going to, for sure, continue
Let's do
this conversation another time. Yeah.
And much appreciation